Frozen grizzly bear begs woman to enter her home. She's shocked by what happens next. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Martha Hensley had lived alone in her remote Wyoming cabin for nearly 2 decades. At 72, she was no stranger to the brutal winters that swallowed the mountains whole, nor to the eerie silence that accompanied the snowfall. But nothing could have prepared her for what she saw that night. It began with a sound, a soft, rhythmic scratching at her front door. At first, she thought it was a tree branch swaying in the wind, but then came a low, guttural sound, barely audible over the howling storm. A growl. Not aggressive, weak. Her fingers curled around the rifle mounted beside the fireplace. Whatever was outside, it wasn't human. With slow, deliberate steps, she approached the frosted window and peered through the icy veil. Her heart nearly stopped. A massive grizzly bear stood just feet from her door. Its fur, once thick and majestic, was now frozen in jagged clumps, its breath coming in short, labored puffs that clouded the frigid air. It swayed slightly, its weight shifting from paw to paw as though it could barely stand. Martha had seen many bears in her lifetime, always at a safe distance, but never had she seen one in such a state. It should have been hibernating. It should have been anywhere but here. And yet, here it was, standing on her porch, staring through the window with hollow, desperate eyes. Every instinct told her to stay inside. Grizzlies were unpredictable, deadly. But this one wasn't here to attack. It was here to beg. The bear lifted one massive paw and pressed it against the wooden door, its claws barely scratching the surface. It let out a sound, not a growl, not a roar, but something else entirely. A plea. Martha's breath caught in her throat. She knew what she had to do. Knew how insane it was. But she had spent a lifetime surviving on instincts, and right now, her gut was telling her something loud and clear. This bear wasn't a threat. It was dying. Her fingers trembled as she unlatched the door. The wood creaked as she pulled it open just enough to let the warm air escape into the bitter night. The bear hesitated, as if waiting for permission. Then, with great effort, it stepped forward, its massive frame barely fitting through the threshold. The moment it entered, the bear collapsed. Martha jumped back, rifle still in hand. But the creature didn't move. It lay sprawled across her floor, its massive body rising and falling in shallow, exhausted breaths. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at the impossible sight before her. Then, something inside her shifted. Carefully, she set the rifle aside and moved toward the bear. Up close, she could see the extent of its suffering, deep gashes along its side, patches of missing fur and a thick layer of ice clinging to its coat. She grabbed a blanket from the couch and draped it over the bear, murmuring soothing words she wasn't sure it could even hear. She stayed awake that night, tending to the creature as if it were a wounded traveler rather than a wild predator. She melted snow over the fire, coaxing a few sips of warm water into its mouth. She packed herbs into its wounds, whispering prayers she hadn't uttered in years. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, but inside, something incredible was happening. By dawn, the bear stirred. It lifted its great head, blinking sluggishly, then shifted its weight, attempting to stand. Martha stepped back, her heart hammering. Would it lash out now that it had regained some strength? Instead, it turned to her, those deep, intelligent eyes locking onto hers. And then, it did something she never could have expected. It huffed softly, and with slow, deliberate movement, pressed its nose against her hand. A gesture of trust. Tears pricked at Martha's eyes. She had spent so many years alone, convinced she needed no one. But now, Kneeling before this battered creature, she realized something profound. Even the wildest of beings sought warmth, safety, connection. The bear stayed for 3 more days, regaining its strength. It ate from the bowl of fresh fish she placed before it, slept beside the crackling fire, and in the quiet moments simply existed alongside her. Then, on the 4th morning, it rose to its feet and lumbered toward the door. Martha followed, her chest tight with something she couldn't quite name. The bear paused at the threshold. It turned, looking at her one last time, and let out a low, rumbling sound, a sound of gratitude. Then, with powerful strides, it disappeared into the snowy wilderness. Martha stood there long after it was gone, the warmth of its presence lingering in the silent cabin. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. Martha Hensley exhaled sharply, realizing she'd been holding her breath. The cabin was eerily silent, except for the rhythmic crackling of the fire and the deep, slow breathing of the massive beast, now sprawled across her floor. Her hands trembled as she wrung out another towel in the basin of warm water. Was she out of her mind? Had she just invited death into her home? The bear's eyes flickered open again, and for a brief moment, Martha thought she saw something beyond pain. Something deeper. Something deeper. Something almost. But she shook the thought away. This was a wild animal, an apex predator, and she was an old woman with nothing but a threadbare sense of logic standing between her and disaster. She had seen injuries before, of course. In her younger years, she'd stitched up farm animals, even a hunting dog once. But this was something else entirely. The gash on the bear's shoulder was deep, too deep, and the raw, exposed skin told her it had been suffering for days. Infection was setting in. If she did nothing, it would die. And yet, if she intervened, what guarantee did she have that it wouldn't lash out the moment it regained strength? The thought sent a fresh wave of doubt coursing through her veins. But then, as if sensing her hesitation, the bear let out a sound, soft, barely more than a whisper of breath. A plea. Martha gritted her teeth. "Well, damn it all," she muttered. "Looks like I'm your fool tonight." She moved carefully, her fingers steady, despite the tremor of adrenaline racing through her. With slow, deliberate movements, she dipped a clean cloth into warm water and gently wiped the edges of the wound. The bear shuddered, but did not resist. Encouraged, she reached for a jar of herbal salve she had made months ago, never expecting to use it on something this large. Her hands worked quickly, pressing the thick ointment into the ragged skin, whispering half-forgotten words of comfort. As the hours crept by, exhaustion pulled at her limbs. The storm outside had grown fiercer, wind rattling the windows with an urgency that felt almost like a warning. But inside, the fire burned strong, casting flickering shadows over the cabin's wooden walls. The bear, despite its immense size, remained still, save for the occasional flick of its ear or the twitch of its claws against the floorboards. Martha sat back on her heels, rubbing her aching wrists. "I hope you know," she said aloud, more to herself than to the bear, "this wasn't in my retirement plan." The bear's only response was a deep, rumbling breath, its massive frame rising and falling with the weight of sleep. As dawn painted the sky with muted streaks of pink and gray, Martha found herself dozing in her rocking chair, a rifle still within arm's reach. But the bear remained where it was, a silent, hulking presence in the dim morning light. It was still alive. For now, that was enough. But questions gnawed at the edges of her mind. Where had it come from? Why had it chosen her cabin, her porch, to collapse upon? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what would she do when it was strong enough to stand again? If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Martha shifted in her chair, bones protesting the movement. Outside, The world was waking, the snowdrifts soft and untouched. The storm had passed, and yet she had the sinking feeling that the real trouble had only just begun. Martha Hensley stood at the threshold of her cabin, the vast snow-covered wilderness stretching before her. The morning air was crisp, biting at her skin despite the thick coat wrapped around her. Behind her, the mother bear shifted near the fire, its eyes locked onto her every movement. It had been watching her all morning, sensing that something was changing. She had spent the last few days gathering supplies, checking the maps, and preparing for the treacherous journey ahead. She knew the bear couldn't stay here forever. No matter how much she had grown accustomed to its presence, no matter how deep their fragile bond had become, it wasn't meant to live within four walls. It belonged to the wild, but there was one problem. Would the bear follow her? Martha tightened the straps of her pack. "Ready, big girl?" she asked, her voice steady but uncertain. The bear huffed softly, stretching its massive frame. Its injured leg was still weak, but its strength had returned enough for it to move steadily. Stepping outside, Martha squinted against the blinding white landscape. The path ahead would not be easy. The snow was deep, the terrain unforgiving, and the cold seeped into her bones like an old ache. Yet, she had made up her mind. She would guide the bear to the wildlife sanctuary, miles away, where it would have the best chance of survival. The mother bear hesitated at the doorway. Martha turned, her breath curling in the icy air. "Come on," she encouraged gently. For a moment, the bear remained still. Then, with deliberate steps, it followed. They trudged through the snow in silence, the only sound the crunching of their footsteps. Martha kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting the bear to turn back. But it didn't. It stayed close, its dark eyes scanning the trees as if wary of unseen dangers. Hours passed, and exhaustion set in. The cold was relentless, gnawing at her fingers and toes. The bear, though stronger than before, limped slightly, a reminder that it was still healing. Martha's heart ached for it. She had lost so much in her life. Her husband, her sense of purpose, the dreams she and James had once shared. And now this bear, this grieving mother, was the closest thing she had to companionship. As they reached the edge of a frozen river, Martha paused. The ice stretched before them, smooth and deceptive. Crossing would be risky, but going around would cost them a day. She turned to the bear. "Think you can make it?" she murmured, mostly to herself. The bear stepped forward, sniffing the air. Then, without hesitation, it placed one massive paw onto the ice. Martha held her breath as it tested its weight. The ice creaked but held firm. She followed, moving carefully. The wind howled around them, carrying whispers of something unseen. Martha's nerves prickled. Something wasn't right. Then, a sound, a sharp snap. The ice cracked beneath them. Martha barely had time to react before her foot slipped. She gasped, arms flailing as the icy surface gave way. "What me? What a day!" The world tilted, and in an instant she was plunging into the freezing water. The shock stole her breath. Cold engulfed her, slicing through her layers of clothing like 1,000 knives. Her limbs locked up, panic surging through her veins. She tried to grab hold of the jagged ice, but her fingers were numb, useless. Then, suddenly, a powerful force. The bear. It lunged forward, its claws digging into the ice. With a strength she couldn't fathom, it clamped its teeth around the hood of her coat and pulled. Martha gasped, coughing as her head broke the surface. The bear dragged her, inch by inch, back onto solid ground. She collapsed onto the snow, shivering violently, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The bear stood over her, panting, its warm breath mingling with the frosty air. Martha blinked up at it, her vision hazy. Had it just Saved her? She let out a weak laugh, coughing as she struggled to sit up. I thought I was saving you, she whispered, her teeth chattering. Looks like you had other plans. The bear huffed, stepping back slightly as if satisfied that she was alive. Martha, still shaking, reached out with trembling fingers. She didn't know why she did it. Perhaps out of gratitude, perhaps out of sheer disbelief. But the bear didn't flinch as her hand brushed against its thick fur. They sat there for a long moment, woman and beast, two souls bound by loss, survival, and something neither of them quite understood. As the wind howled around them once more, Martha knew one thing for certain. This bear wasn't just a passing presence in her life. It had changed her, just as she had changed it. And together, they would face whatever lay ahead. Martha Hensley stirred from her makeshift camp, her body stiff from the cold. The embers of last night's fire still smoldered, casting a faint orange glow against the blanket of white surrounding them. Beside her, the mother bear lay curled, its breath steady, a stark contrast to the fierce protector it had been just hours ago. Martha exhaled slowly, watching the morning light filter through the towering pines. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind. The wolves, the warning growls, the silent understanding that had passed between her and the bear. They had fought together, survived together. But what came next? Shaking off the remnants of sleep, she rose to her feet, rubbing warmth back into her aching limbs. The bear shifted, ears twitching as if sensing her movement. Martha glanced toward the frozen river, the landscape still and untouched. The world was eerily quiet, as if the forest itself was waiting. We should keep moving, she murmured, half expecting the bear to ignore her. Instead, the creature lifted its head, eyes locking onto hers. There was no hesitation in its gaze, only an unspoken agreement. They pressed forward, each step sinking into the powdery snow. Martha's muscles protested, but she forced herself onward, knowing that time was against them. The sanctuary was still miles away, and with each passing moment the temperature seemed to drop. By midday, the sun was little more than a dull glow behind a thick veil of clouds. Martha's breath came in short bursts, curling in the air like ghosts of exhaustion. The bear trudged beside her, its injured legs slowing it down, but not stopping it. There was something remarkable about the way it moved, as if sheer willpower alone kept it going. Then, without warning, the ground beneath Martha gave way. She gasped, the world tilting as her foot sank into an unseen hole beneath the snow. Her body lurched forward, and before she could react, she was tumbling down a short, steep incline. Snow filled her mouth, her vision spinning, the sound of rushing wind roaring in her ears. When she finally came to a stop, she was lying in a shallow ravine, half buried in powder. Pain radiated through her side where she had landed, but nothing felt broken. A deep, guttural sound rumbled from above. Martha forced herself to sit up, wincing as she turned her gaze upward. The bear stood at the edge of the drop, its head lowered, eyes scanning her with sharp intensity. It made a low, questioning noise, a sound Martha had come to recognize as concern. "I'm fine," she called, though her voice was weaker than she intended. The cold was already leaching the heat from her body. "Just stop." The bear huffed, and to her astonishment, began descending the incline. The way it moved, slow, deliberate, made it clear it understood the risk. But it came anyway. Martha swallowed hard, watching as the bear carefully placed one paw after another, sliding slightly but never losing its footing. It reached her in seconds, its enormous frame towering over her. Then, to her utter disbelief, it lowered itself, positioning its body beside her as if offering support. She hesitated only a moment before gripping onto its thick fur. With a heave, she pulled herself upright, using the bear's weight for stability. Her legs wobbled, but she stayed standing, The bear turned its head, studying her as if checking for further injury. Martha let out a breathless chuckle. "Guess I owe you one." The bear only blinked before turning back toward the incline. Without hesitation, it started its slow ascent, pausing just enough to let Martha follow, using its steps as a guide. When they finally reached level ground, she collapsed onto the snow, breathless but relieved. She turned to the bear. "Why are you still here?" It didn't answer, of course, but there was something in its gaze that told her everything she needed to know. They weren't just traveling together anymore. They were surviving together. And somehow, against all odds, they had become something more than just a woman and a bear. They had become a team. In life, we often find ourselves navigating through unexpected challenges, much like Martha Hensley and the injured bear. The story is more than just a tale of survival. It's a reflection of the resilience, trust, and unexpected bonds that shape our own lives. Martha, who once lived in solitude, believing that isolation was the only way to cope with her loss, found herself in an unforeseen companionship with a creature that symbolized both strength and vulnerability. Together, they forged ahead through the frozen wilderness, battling not just the dangers of the wild, but the internal struggles that had held them captive for so long. This journey mirrors the way we confront hardships in our lives. There are times when we feel lost, burdened by grief, uncertainty, or loneliness, just as Martha did. But the lesson her story teaches us is that healing isn't about erasing the pain. It's about finding meaning despite it. Like the bear, we all carry wounds, whether emotional or physical, and sometimes the path to recovery is not one we can walk alone. It takes trust to accept help, and courage to offer it in return. In today's world, we often hesitate to connect with others out of fear of vulnerability. We assume that strength comes from self-reliance, from keeping our struggles to ourselves. But Martha's experience with the bear reminds us that strength is not just about enduring difficulties alone. It's about finding the will to keep going, even when we don't know where the journey will take us. The companionship between them was never planned, but it became something powerful, something transformative. In the same way, the relationships we build, whether with people, animals, or through experiences, have the potential to redefine our lives. The moment Martha reaches the wildlife sanctuary is bittersweet. She has succeeded in her mission, yet the thought of parting with the bear weighs on her. How often do we face such moments in life? Letting go of people we love, of phases that once defined us, of experiences that changed us. It's never easy. But just as Martha learned, some journeys are meant to come to an end, not as a loss, but as a transition. The bear needed to return to the wild, and Martha needed to return to herself, forever changed by what they had shared. In real life, growth often means letting go, trusting that what we have given or received has left a lasting impact. As she walks back to her cabin, she realizes something profound. The wilderness, once a symbol of loneliness, now feels alive with possibility. Her perspective has shifted, and she no longer feels trapped by grief. This is a lesson we can all take to heart. Life is unpredictable, and hardships will come. But within every challenge lies an opportunity for connection, renewal, and transformation. We just have to be willing to open the door to a new experience, a new relationship, or even to an injured bear on a cold winter night. Because sometimes the most unexpected encounters are the ones that heal us the most. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of resilience, hope, and the unbreakable spirit of life. See you in the next story.